We're so thrilled to have such a wonderful RSVP and turnout. Looks like we've got about 50 people on the Zoom today. We knew that housing elements were really exciting and really in right now, but it's exciting to see that all of you think that way too and want to learn more and learn how you can get involved. So this is our second installment from our Lunch and Learn series, which we are hosting this year as part of our 40th year anniversary. So EBHO has been around for 4 decades. If you're a new member, if you've been with us a long time, thank you for your support, and we'll give you some more information at the end of the presentation about how you can continue to be involved with East Bay Housing Organization's work. So today we are going to go through housing elements. My colleague Jeff Levine, who is the Senior Director of Policy, Erin Tiedemann, who's our Policy Manager, and I will be giving the presentation. We're going to start with an introduction to housing elements, go through lessons learned from this most recent update cycle known as the 6th cycle, and then we're going to give you some information about how to get involved. Feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those at the Q&A time. And then the last 5 minutes of today, we're going to all collectively work together to take action. So I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Jeff, who's going to start us off with an intro to housing elements. Take it away, Jeff.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. So let me just start with what is a housing element. A housing element is the local plan for how the jurisdiction will meet the housing needs in the community. It is part of a jurisdiction's general plan. General plans have multiple elements to them, covering a host of things: transportation, land use, open space, and so on. The housing element, though, is covered by a lot more requirements for both content and process than the other parts of a general plan. And most importantly, it's the only element that needs to be approved by the state. So there are some really strong requirements here. Housing elements have to be updated every 8 years. Each 8-year period is known as a housing element cycle. The due dates for housing elements are staggered among regions. So Southern California, San Diego area, Sacramento area, the 9-county Bay Area, each of them has their own schedule because the state can't review all the housing elements for every jurisdiction in the state at the same time. So they're on a rotating cycle. However, within a region, all the housing elements are due at the same time. So in the Bay Area, the most recent housing elements for 109 jurisdictions were all due by January 31st of 2023. As we'll see, many jurisdictions didn't meet that deadline. The housing element must show how a jurisdiction's land use, zoning, and other policies will contribute to meeting the jurisdiction's fair share of the region's and the state's housing goals at all economic levels. But it's important to remember that while the housing element is a planning document and must show that the jurisdiction has planned for and can accommodate that housing, there is no requirement that those units actually get built. Cities are not on the hook for actually building them. They are on the hook for putting up barriers that make it difficult. And that's where a lot of our advocacy comes in, is to make sure that jurisdictions are actually following through to do everything they can to make sure that that housing actually gets built. So let's move on and take a look at the process of developing housing elements, which comes in 2 parts. The first has to do with determining housing need. You'll hear a lot about housing needs around housing elements. The first step is that the state determines how much new housing is required in each region. That number is given to the Regional Council of Governments. In the Bay Area, that's the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG. And this is called the Regional Housing Needs Determination. So that's the number that comes from the state to the region. Once the region receives that number, it has to allocate that need among all of the jurisdictions, the cities and the counties in the region. This is sometimes called the fair share allocation, and it has to consider factors like proximity to jobs and transportation, existing concentrations of low-income populations, and most recently, a lot more emphasis on promoting fair housing and racial equity. The result of this exercise is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA. You'll hear that term a lot when working on housing elements, and every city talks about their RHNA, which is a set of numbers of how much housing that they have to accommodate. The way that this gets developed in the Bay Area, ABAG establishes a housing methodology committee that basically comes up with the formula for distributing that regional number among the jurisdictions. EBHO was a member of that committee, and along with our allies, we pushed for fair housing and equity considerations to play a major role. And as a result, for the first time, we were able to boost the number of units that was assigned to historically exclusionary suburbs with high concentrations of affluent white populations that have historically been resistant to new housing. It's important to remember that RHNA allocations for each jurisdiction aren't just a single number. They're broken down by income level, showing the needs separately for very low, low, moderate, and above moderate income housing. And meeting the need for very low and low income housing, among other things, requires having enough land zoned for multifamily housing. So cities have to provide zoning for apartment buildings in order to meet their lower income housing need. And as we'll see, this can be very contentious because many jurisdictions just don't want to build much more than traditional single family homes, saying that they want to, quote, preserve the character of their city. It's also important to recognize that regional need and thus the RHNA numbers for each jurisdiction can change significantly from one housing element cycle to another. And in this most recent cycle, changes in state law resulted in a big increase in the regional number and thus the RHNA for each city. And these increases made the process more difficult. So this chart shows what happened with RHNA in Alameda County. So you can see there was a huge jump from the fifth cycle, which was 2014 to 2022, and the sixth cycle, which covers 2023 to 2031. The Bay Area as a whole saw its numbers go from a little over 180,000 to 440,000. So in most places, the RHNA numbers more than doubled, and that posed its own challenges for many cities, as we will see. Once the RHNA is published and adopted by ABAG, cities have to get work on drafting their housing elements. It's a lengthy process with a lot of requirements. And we'll come back in a minute to look at what the elements that go into a housing element are. But a major part of that work is going to be identifying specific sites where housing can be built and showing that that's realistic and can accommodate that RHNA that we just talked about. State law specifically requires that local governments make a diligent effort to achieve public participation of all economic segments throughout the process. And so that's going to include workshops, town halls, surveys, and hopefully as many opportunities as possible for us to participate, identify needs, and advocate for policies. Once the housing element's prepared, it's published for public comment for at least 30 days. Jurisdictions have to accept written comments and also have to hold at least one public hearing on the draft element. They then must wait at least 10 days, make revisions in response to the comments they received, and then submit the draft to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. HCD gets 90 days to review the housing element and either approve it or provide comment and feedback on what needs to be changed. And this is also another opportunity for advocates to communicate directly with HCD even after the local comment period has closed. In the end, HCD sends a review letter to the jurisdiction, generally saying what needs to be changed before it can be adopted. It's pretty rare for HCD to approve the draft element without changes. Based on that review letter, the jurisdiction has to revise the housing element and again publish it for public comment. But this time there's only 7 days required. And so advocates need to move pretty fast once we start seeing these subsequent revisions. And then finally, there are annual reporting requirements, which we can talk about later. So let's talk about the major components that go into a housing element. We can do whole workshops on this, so I'm going to be very brief. There are extensive requirements for public participation that have to be serious efforts to involve all segments of the community, particularly the people who have the worst housing needs, really need to be involved in the process of not only identifying needs, but helping to shape the policies and programs, and at the back end, being involved in the annual reporting and any adjustments that need to be made. There needs to be an assessment of past performance to look at how well the last housing element did. Did it achieve its goals? How many units actually got produced? Which policies are we keeping and which ones are we getting rid of? A major part of the housing element is a needs assessment, very detailed. It looks at characteristics of the population, the housing market, housing problems like overpayment, overcrowding, and substandard housing. We need to take a look at the needs of groups with special needs like seniors, people with disabilities, large families, unhoused people, and so on. And of course, there has to be a description of the jurisdiction's RENA. Newly introduced this cycle is a requirement for an assessment of fair housing conditions, which needs to look at patterns of integration and segregation, identifying areas of racially or ethnically concentrated areas of either poverty or racially concentrated areas of affluence, and looking at disparities in access to opportunities and disproportionate housing needs based on race and other factors. The other parts include an analysis of constraints on housing, both governmental and non-governmental. Governmental constraints are things like land use controls and zoning. Non-governmental means the availability of financing, land costs, and neighborhood opposition. There is a site inventory that has to describe that the jurisdiction has enough sites that are suitable for accommodating the entire RENA at all income levels. That means specifically that there have to be sites zoned at enough density to build multifamily housing that can be affordable to lower income households. They have to be realistic sites. There's a bunch of new requirements about demonstrating that these sites are realistic. And finally, there's an action program that lays out the city's goals, objectives, policies, and programs to address all these issues we already talked about, and then a set of quantified objectives of what the city thinks realistically it can do. This housing element cycle was further shaped and complicated really by a number of new laws. The first was affirmatively furthering fair housing. This was Assembly Bill 686 back in 2018, and it requires cities to address equity and fair housing issues in all of their housing and community development programs, and had an extensive set of requirements for what needs to go into a housing element around public outreach, the fair housing assessment, incorporating fair housing questions into the site inventory, looking at the underlying contributing factors. It's not just about stopping discrimination, it's about taking affirmative action to remove or reduce barriers. A second change was stricter requirements about what constitutes an adequate site and the kind of evidence that the jurisdictions need to provide, especially if they are using non-vacant sites and saying that an abandoned commercial center, for example, will be converted to housing, needs to show that that's a realistic expectation. There's now something called the no net loss rule, which says it's not enough to produce a housing inventory when you prepare your housing element. The jurisdiction has to be monitoring for the entire 8-year period whether they still have adequate sites. And so if they don't approve enough housing units on a site, if they said in their housing element, we can build 200 units here, and they build 100 units, or they said this site could build lower income housing, but they build market rate housing, they have to make sure that somewhere else they have enough sites. And if they don't have enough left in their inventory, they can't approve those projects until they identify additional sites so that they are always maintaining an inventory. You've probably read about a rule called the builder's remedy. If a city does not complete its housing element on time or is otherwise out of compliance and doesn't have a valid housing element, then there is a provision in state law that says that builders can build housing regardless of the zoning. So if the zoning says you can only build single-family housing here, if there's no housing element in place and approved, a developer can use the builder's remedy to build housing that is much denser multifamily, provided there's some level of affordable housing in there. But this is getting used a lot as we find multiple areas that didn't adopt their housing elements. And lastly, the state has gotten a lot more serious about holding jurisdictions accountable for carrying out their housing elements. There is a new housing compliance unit in the Department of Housing and Community Development. There are folks in the state attorney general's office, and cities are being called to task both for not completing their housing elements and for not implementing them. You may have read, for example, that the state really cracked down on San Francisco and required them to make a number of changes in their processes in order to stay in compliance with housing law. So all of these things made the process a lot more complicated. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Aaron and look at what actually happened in this last cycle.
Thank you for that, Jeff. So I'm now going to talk about the findings of how all this sort of shook out. All these findings are in our report that we just released the other day about the lessons learned from this cycle and sort of what we can fix in the future. So I encourage you all to take a look at that. We're very proud of it and happy to have it out there. In brief, these are our key findings from these, and a lot of these do hinge on some of those new laws that Jeff ran through. So the higher targets, the stricter standards, the importance of affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH. But there's also some that are more on the other side of things that are not coming from the state. Local governments were not really ready to do some of this work, or some jurisdictions just didn't want to. So we're going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail now. So first, in this cycle, everyone was held to a higher standard overall. There were new laws, there were bigger requirements, there was just more trying to push everybody forward. One of the biggest of those is the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, for pretty much every city and county increased a lot. For the entire Bay, it more than doubled. And so most cities, most jurisdictions were dealing with a more than doubling of the amount of units they had to plan for, which was already a difficult thing for them to do in previous cycles. That was a big hoop for everybody to jump through, of finding more sites, putting more density on those sites, and having them be more realistic. Another was the need for really hyper-specific language to meet those high standards. If there was a requirement in state law that local zoning law not be an impediment to the building of, say, group homes, then your housing element needed to say, our zoning law is not an impediment to group homes, and you needed to show your work. You could not rely on the state to read between the lines. And that tripped up a lot of people. There was a lot of times where new drafts of housing elements were largely fixing pretty administrative stuff. They were making that language be specific enough to meet the standards of the state. Another on that same metric was that everything needed a clear plan and a timeline. So you needed to say not that the city would consider rezoning of this neighborhood or have it on an agenda in the future. You need to say, we will have rezoning in these neighborhoods. It will come to the council by this date, and it will create zoning for up to an X number of new units. There had to be a clear timeline and plan. And that was a big change this cycle, because in previous cycles, that wishy-washy language of consider or, we'll think about was a big part of housing elements. Lastly, on this big key finding is just that the rejections were common and they took a long time. Like Jeff said, HCD had 60 or 90 days, depending on which submittal you were in, to review people's housing elements. That meant that people were sending one in, waiting that full time period to get it back, having to go through a lengthy process to edit it, bring it back for public hearings, talk with HCD on the phone about specifics about what they wanted. And most cities had to go through that at least 3 times. That was the average in the East Bay. So that's 3 submittals and 3 long waiting processes and multiple public hearings just to get there. So the next big bucket was the AFFH rule. Jeff mentioned this earlier. This is the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that California put in place. It goes after the federal version of this rule that was passed in the 60s. This had a really big impact because it added a big new focus of housing elements and a new section that they had to complete. And it tripped up a lot of communities. So first was that exclusionary communities, usually whiter, wealthier, more single-family neighborhoods, those were firmly in the spotlight and were a focus of AFFH. The goal of a lot of AFFH policies is to make those sorts of communities more accessible to people who have not had access to them before, because it's trying to redress systematic racism and segregation in housing policy. Those communities couldn't keep those same sort of exclusionary policies. They had to consider things that would make it easier to build multifamily, affordable homes in those communities. NIMBY's not in my backyard. The type of people who we often hear about a lot in the news who are saying, I really like my neighborhood, I like my single family home, I don't want there to be a giant building next to me. those people were still loud. They were still often the most organized in a lot of jurisdictions. But because of AFFH, they couldn't take up all the oxygen in the room. In previous planning cycles, it's often been that because that voice is so loud and organized, it is really hard for cities and counties and elected officials in those cities to ignore that voice, to try and do something against it. AFFH made it so that there was a requirement from the state, making it so that cities had to go back to the drawing board and say, you know what, this may be what some people in our community wants, and those voices may be loud, but we have a duty to do something else. There's an important caveat to all this of AFFH is really important, and it did really do a lot to advance housing justice, but it still left a fair amount of wiggle room, and the tools are not perfect for implementing it. AFFH was a big part of people's housing elements and a really big part of what they had to do that was new, but it wasn't always the focus of everyone's housing element. Often they kind of wrote the housing element that they were going to design anyway, and then justified how it related to AFFH requirements after the fact. So there was still a lot of wiggle room about how it was implemented, and it made it so that housing justice had to be some of the focus, but it didn't always make it be the core, which it could be. It also in flawed tools, the best example of this is opportunity maps. The tax credit allocation committee at the state level and basically the funding decisions about what affordable housing gets funded use these maps showing what are areas of higher opportunity, of educational, economic mobility, and what are places of lower opportunity. Those maps often mean that we're focusing on the putting affordable housing and putting new resources in exclusionary areas, and not necessarily putting affordable housing in areas of existing disadvantaged communities to try and keep them there. We have to do both, and these tools aren't adapted to doing all of those things at once. So there still needs to be some improvement there to really make AFFH address everything it needs to about housing justice. So the previous findings were mostly about the new things from the state. This is about what was going on the local side. So a lot of local governments just were not quite prepared or just didn't have the resources and time they needed to tackle this new scope of work. Like we said, there's much higher standards and there's more units to plan for and more to do, but a lot of people weren't really ready to take that on. So first of just the simplest one of these is that a lot of jurisdictions just didn't start their housing element process until kind of the last minute. A lot of jurisdictions didn't start doing all the analysis they needed to on their housing element of looking at who lives here now? Are they renters or are they owners? What are the racial and economic demographics in our community? Sort of looking at the housing need. A lot of people didn't do that until they had the RHNA numbers. People could have gotten started a lot earlier on the baseline work and then been a lot more ready to dig into what are we going to do about it after having done that data collection. Another was just that local elected officials come from all walks of life. Not all of them read housing elements for fun. And they're difficult documents to understand. They're 400 to 600 to 800 pages of pretty dense analysis and housing and zoning law. The difficulty absorbing all that meant that a lot of places were not ideally situated to understand what they were trying to do. So a lot of local elected officials, the city councils and board of supervisors who are making decisions about these housing elements weren't focusing on the biggest decisions that they needed to dig into, but were instead talking about the ones that the NIMBY voices were talking loudest about. There was a misallocation of focus. This wasn't all on the local government side. The state also had struggles with resources and timelines. Those meetings were delayed. They weren't always happening on time. And it was just very hard to get enough staff time to review all 109 local units of government in the Bay Area in a timely manner, provide specific feedback to all of them, and provide the data tools that everybody needed, and do all of that in a reasonable turnaround. Everybody needs more resources if we want to do this quickly and do it well. So lastly, on the key findings is part of what made this dramatic in that some jurisdictions just really did not want to comply. I think we've all seen headlines about this. These are the most dramatic examples of this housing cycle where a lot of jurisdictions did get down to work. This is not by any means the majority, but a lot of jurisdictions did choose to, instead of trying to fulfill the requirements of the housing element, fight the state's ability to give them standards. And so some of the new penalties that Jeff mentioned earlier helped with this. In the past, this process has really been characterized by a lot of carrot and very little stick. There was more stick this time around, and it did help. The builder's remedy has resulted in enough projects in the Bay that it's seemed to motivate some people to get on board. And others who weren't making a serious effort have been sued by either the state accountability units or housing organizations who want them to really get to work on their housing elements. And that accountability will continue forward. There are those accountability units in the Department of Justice and the Housing Department. They are going to keep monitoring people. San Francisco, after it got an approved housing element, was subject to a review recently. But some people will still slip through the cracks because there's only so much the state can do to fight that. So those were the key findings. We've got just a couple policy recommendations of what we could be thinking about 7 years when we're doing the 7th cycle housing element process. What do we want to have changed to make this easier or more effective? And the first one of those is just providing more funding and technical assistance for governments at every level. Like I mentioned, people struggled with having enough staff time. HCD had a really big job and wasn't always able to do it in quick as it was needed or provide the individualized feedback that everyone would have wanted. So having more funding, more staffing at the HCD level, and more funding and staffing at the local level would be really helpful to make this process go a lot smoother. Next is emphasizing that affirmatively furthering fair housing section as a central piece of the housing element. This new requirement did have a big impact on making people focus on housing justice and turning the course of where we're going more towards that goal. But it still wasn't the core of many housing elements. This process could be made even more effective by having this be a core focus and the central piece of the housing element. And then lastly, it would be helpful if we funded affordable housing. Like we've been talking about, the standards have gone up and the number of units that cities are expected to have at the end of the cycle keep going up. But we've stopped short of actually requiring that to be funded. We are constantly, in our previous cycles, under-providing the affordable units from our RETA and over-providing the market rate. Whereas if we had a real requirement for housing elements to include a commitment to find funding for housing, then we might see that start to go the other way and build more of that affordable housing that we need. With that, I'll pass it over to Lindsay.
Thanks, Aaron. Really appreciate both Jeff and Aaron for bringing housing elements to life and explaining why they're so important and where we are in the process and some lessons learned. So now here's an exciting part. I'm going to talk about how you can get involved. We're going to do a little Q&A, and then at the end, we're all going to take 5 minutes and take action together to make sure cities are furthering their housing elements. There's 2 main ways that you can get involved. One is to hold your jurisdiction, your city, your town, your county accountable for implementing the plan that they put in their housing element. So as Aaron and Jeff talked about, it's a lot of work. There are really big targets for increasing the number of units that are affordable to low income and very low income folks in your city and town. So you want to make sure that you're holding your jurisdiction, your town, your city, and your county accountable for implementing the plans that they said they were going to do that were approved by the state. And then secondly, as Aaron mentioned, these affordable housing goals are really huge and they're really important to help try to pull us out of the affordable housing crisis that we've been experiencing in the Bay and across the state. And luckily, there is an amazing solution for this. There is a campaign going on right now to support a 10 to 20 billion, that's billion with a B, regional bond that would fund the affordable housing development in the 9-county Bay Area and help all of those jurisdictions, towns and cities and counties meet their affordable housing goals. So how you can make sure that your city and town and county are following the plan that they outlined in their housing element is to check in on their annual progress reports. Every city, town, and county has to produce this report annually, which shows their data on housing development, which shows how many applications they've received, how many sites have gone through entitlement, how many building permits have been granted, and how many sites have completed construction. And when these annual progress reports are released, there will be public hearings and a chance for you to comment on the progress. Maybe your jurisdiction's doing great. They're on target to meet their goals. Maybe they're not. Either way, you will have the opportunity to provide comment on that progress, and we will be providing more information when the first APRs for this cycle are released in April. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, you can go to the state's website. This is on the Housing and Community Development website, and you can look at the dashboard and the annual progress reports that have been published in the past. You can look at your city, your county, you can look at the whole state. So this example here, I filtered for Oakland and filtered for 2022. And as you can see, this shows how many building permits were submitted, entitled, permitted, and how many projects were completed and how many units was a result. There are several different pages. As you can see, this is only screen 2 of 16 ways to look at the data, so you can see how they're doing not just overall on meeting their numbers, but how they're doing specifically on those categories of very low income, and moderate housing for folks that cannot afford the market because the market does not provide for them. So back to that ballot measure. East Bay Housing Organizations has the privilege of being the lead campaign organization in Alameda and Contra Costa County for this multi-billion-dollar regional bond that's going to show up in all 9 counties on the November 2024 ballot. The coalition is called Bay Area Housing for All. If you have not already signed up to endorse this bond, I encourage you to do that. We'll take a minute to do that together at the end of this presentation if you have not already. So we need more money to create below market rate affordable housing, right? The market creates what the market will bear, and anyone that can't afford the market needs public subsidy in order to have housing that's affordable to them, so they're not cost burden. And this will be a game-changing. It's the first time anywhere in the state of California that there's been a regional housing finance authority created to address the issues on a regional scale the way that we need to in order to turn around this crisis. So the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority was established by law a few years ago. It was a piece of legislation introduced by Assemblymember Chu, and it's housed at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, also known as MTC, and the Association of Bay Area Governments, also known as ABAG. And BAFA is focused on regional affordable housing solutions, so again, across the 9-county Bay Area, and has prioritized what we call the 3 Ps of production, so producing new affordable housing units, preservation, preserving existing affordable housing units for low and middle income households, and 3, protections. So protecting tenants who are at risk of displacement and eviction. And all 3 of those Ps are a priority for the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. If it's a $10 billion bond that we see in November, because we're still sorting out what the exact dollar amount is going to be that's going to go on the ballot, a $10 million bond would produce and preserve upwards of 45,000 affordable homes across the 9-county Bay Area, including Contra Costa and Alameda County. It would unlock over $38 billion with a B dollars for affordable housing from other funding sources. So those of you that work in affordable housing development know that you don't just need local funding, you need state, federal, sometimes philanthropic, sometimes a commercial bank loan in order to make these projects go forward. So this regional bond would be able to leverage and unlock affordable housing funding sources from all those different areas. And it would house around 500,000 low-income households over the lifetime of the developments. And some quick math tells us that a $20 billion bond, or double that, would double the impact. So we're talking about again, it's a really game-changing opportunity that we have to pass this bond in November and to get the affordable housing that's so deeply needed in Alameda and Contra Costa built, which again will help the jurisdictions meet their housing element plans where they have requirements for building affordable projects that are affordable to very low income and low income households. So with that, we'll go to Q&A. We'll take a few minutes. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. I see we have one question from Anne asking if the Furthering Fair Housing addresses access for people of different income levels to high resource areas, or just different groups of different races or ethnicities. Jeff, would you like to answer that one?
Sure. The answer is both yes and no. Explicitly, no. Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing focuses on share housing around what are legally protected classes: race, ethnicity, disability, gender, etc. Income alone is not a protected class. However, given the interaction between race and income in particular, anything that is designed to increase the ability of racial minorities to move into high resource areas, which tend to be predominantly white, is going to mean putting affordable housing into those areas because people of color are disproportionately low income. And so while actions to affirmatively further fair housing don't explicitly address this issue of low income access to high income areas, the actions that you actually have to take to do this would definitely tie into that.
Thank you for that, and hope that answers your question. Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes,
Thank you
please
for
go
the
ahead.
informative presentation and so good to see so many familiar faces. So this the report we're discussing today is for this region, and this region is the 9-county Bay Area. But how do we know when a region is going to be undergoing that process? Is there a schedule on the HDC website, or how do we keep up with this?
Jeff, you want to take that one?
Yeah, and I'm going to take a minute to put HCD's website up because a lot of this information is there. Okay, so this is HCD's housing element page. And if you scroll down, there are a bunch of topics here, including open data tools, which is particularly important. A lot of this is guidance about what's required. The open data tools includes right here, this update schedules. We just completed the 6th cycle. This is also how you get to the dashboard on results, but you can see what the past schedules are and what the schedule is going to be for the 7th cycle of housing elements as well. So yes, these are published on HCD's site. Different regions are on different cycles, but they're all on an 8-year revolving cycle. Other things that are on here while we've got this up, there's a housing element download tool, so you can actually download all of the submitted housing elements. There's a review and compliance report and a database of the review letters that the state has sent to the cities. This is really useful if you want to see what HCD is actually saying to the cities and how they are commenting. It's a really useful tool. And lastly, I'll just note this section here, housing elements building blocks, is a really extensive sort of training and guide to preparing housing elements that HCD has developed over the years, and I would highly recommend it to people.
Thanks, Jeff. Erin, anything to add to that?
Just like you mentioned, every region is on a slightly different timeline. So we're at the start of our 8 years. The LA area went before us, but it's all regular. Everyone's cycle is 8 years long. So every 8 years, you'll have to do a new housing element, and there'll be a new set of laws and new opportunities to comment on it.
Lena, does that answer your question? Okay, great. Okay, well, in our last few minutes together, I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to take action together. So as I mentioned, the name of the campaign for this regional bond is called Bay Area Housing for All. And the website is housingforall.org. So if you are in support of having $10 to $20 billion on the ballot and being approved to create new affordable housing units all across the 9-county Bay Area, including Alameda and Contra Costa County, you can go to the website. Kiki has just dropped it in the chat. Thank you so much. So go ahead and click on that hyperlink, and you can go ahead and enter your name, your email address, your zip code. If you're affiliated with an organization, you can do that, or you can leave that blank if you're just responding as an individual, and click on the I endorse button. This will share your information with the Bay Area Housing for All campaign that you endorse the bond, and then you will be also given updates, again, when more opportunities to get involved in the campaign leading up to November. If you represent an organization and you'd like to endorse the bond, or you would like a presentation about the bond, you can email Angelina at ebho.org, and Angelina Cornejo, our campaign strategy coordinator, will be in touch with you about putting your organization's name on our list of organizations that have endorsed, and or giving a presentation to your organization so they can make an informed decision about endorsing. And then finally, if you're still on that same website, Bay.org, if you look up at the top of the menu, you will see where it says supporters, which I've circled here. If you click on that, you will see all of the elected officials by county, so Alameda County at the top, who have come out in support of the bond. We are encouraging you to look for your mayor's name. So if you live in Berkeley, here I've highlighted that Mayor Arreguin has already come out in endorsement of the bond. But you can scroll through and see if your mayor is listed on this list of elected officials who have endorsed the bond already. And then we would love for you to send either an email thanking them for endorsing the bond if they're on the list, and asking them to endorse the bond if they're not on the list. And there will be a link in the chat right now that will take you to this instruction page where you can scroll down, and we provided the email addresses for all of the mayors in Alameda and Contra Costa County, and a short few sentences of text that you can cut and paste into an email to send to them, or if you'd prefer to call them, you can call them and either, again, thank them if they're already on this list because they've endorsed the bond. And if they're not on this list, then you need to ask them why not and encourage them to do so as soon as possible so that we know, so that they're on this list and people know that your community is a pro-affordable housing community and looking for this regional solution to help their jurisdictions meet their housing element requirements. So I know we're just at time now, so I think we'll leave it at that, and we'll provide more information when we send the email recap to all of you that were able to attend today. Thank you again so much for your time and energy and your attention today, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully next Thursday for our next Lunch and Learn.